Welcome, everybody.
Hello, hello. It's good to see so many familiar faces.
Hi, everyone. People are still trickling in, but
Okay. Adrienne, I'll wait for you to give me the signal.
yeah, Rabbi, I think we're okay to start. I'll let in
Yeah.
anybody who comes a little bit late. Folks, as ever, we're going to keep you muted while Professor Gitelman is speaking. And if you have any questions for him, we're going to try to save the last few minutes of the program for a little Q&A. So we would encourage you to put questions in the chat, and I will get to as many as possible in the last few minutes. Thanks so much. Rabbi, over to you.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm very excited about this program tonight. The Cantors and I were speaking about bringing someone who could help us understand the history of the Jewish people in Ukraine. There's plenty that we have access to regarding the politics, regarding the geopolitics, regarding the military strategy, all of that. But we felt it helpful for us to locate our people in the Ukraine. And it's a really extraordinary history, some of it really remarkable and breathtaking. Some of our most important sages were from Ukraine, lived there, taught there, and their works are still inspiring. Many of you know their names because I quote them often. And of course, there were periods that were exceedingly dark and horrifying. Babin Yar, just to mention one. So we wanted to understand the history of the Jewish people there. And Cantor Elena and Cantor Sergey told me that the person to bring is Dr. Tzvi Gitelman. They knew of him. They had heard him speak and said that he was the perfect person to help us understand this part of our history. And so we were able to secure his expertise tonight, and we're really grateful that he's with us, and I know it's going to be an extraordinary evening of important learning. So I want to turn the Zoom over now to one of the leaders of our adult learning initiatives at Temple Sinai, Barbara Klein, to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good evening. On behalf of our Adult Engagement Committee, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. We are so pleased to have Professor Tzvi Gitelman with us tonight to bring us his views on current events in Ukraine. Dr. Gitelman received all of his degrees from Columbia University, as well as his Bachelor in Hebrew Literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Preston Tisch Professor Emeritus of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He has written or edited 19 books and many articles on Soviet, Eastern European, and Israeli politics. The books include A Century of Ambivalence, The Jews in Russia and the Soviet Union, 1881 to the present, Jewish Identities in Post-Communist Russia and Ukraine, a certain ethnicity, and The New Jewish Diaspora, Russian-speaking immigrants in Israel, the US, and Germany. Professor Gitelman's current research is on Soviet Jewish combatants in World War II, the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and the politics of history in former socialist states. I can think of no one more qualified to speak to us tonight on the pressing issues concerning us at this time. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Tzvi Gitelman.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you and share some ruminations about a very tragic ongoing situation. About 6 weeks ago, in the Orthodox Minyan here in Ann Arbor, where I daven, at the conclusion of the Shabbat service, our rabbi said, and now we're going to say some psalms, some Tehillim, for the people of Ukraine and the Jews of Ukraine. Frankly, I was very much taken aback. The idea of Jews praying for the welfare of Ukrainians was simply shocking. As a child, I remember debates among refugees. We didn't call them survivors in those days, we called them refugees, who would argue amongst each other who was the worst during the war. Of course, World War II. Of course, the Germans were terrible, but depending on where you came from, you would say, but the Poles were worse, the Ukrainians were worse, the Romanians were worse, the Hungarians were worse. Yitzhak Shamir, former Prime Minister of Israel, said publicly, Poles drink in anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. His father had been killed during the German occupation by a Polish neighbor living in Belarus. We have a long history, which I'll touch upon, with the Ukrainian people. Does history matter? Well, Henry Ford, a hero of American civilization, and as we would say, a ganz feiner Antisemit, rabid anti-Semite, once said, history is bunk. He was wrong. Shamir's statement delayed the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Poland and Israel for several months. The Poles were understandably offended by what he had said. History actually does affect attitudes and behaviors. I used to tell my American students that while American historical memory generally extends to the day before yesterday, Europeans suffer from a surfeit of history. People in Europe are still agitated about events that occurred hundreds of years ago. And it's only very lately, in the last few years, that Americans have fought political battles over historical issues, tearing down of monuments, changing the names of colleges, expunging this or that. We've suddenly become historical experts and revisionists. A historical event can be molded into a meaningful history, one that activates attitudes and behaviors by its interpretation and representation. Today, Serbs, Turks, and Albanians get very emotional about a battle that was fought in Kosovo. When? In the year 1389. Israeli Jews and Arabs still differ strongly and violently about the meaning, the significance of the 1948 war. For Jews, it was the War of Independence. For Arabs, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. Today, people are killing each other over whether Ukraine is Russian, whether Crimea, rather, is Russian or Ukrainian. The fact is that for most of its history, Crimea belonged to the Ottoman Turks and then to the Russians. But in 1954, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, then the leader of the Soviet Union, decided to mark the 300th anniversary of a treaty in the town of Pereyaslav in Ukraine. By the way, the town where Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer, was born. the 300th anniversary of a treaty which he and others construed as a treaty between Ukrainians and Russians, and as a symbol of Russian magnitude, Crimea was transferred from the Russian Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian. So what Putin did much more recently was a retransfer of Crimea from Ukraine to Russia, this time by force. Now, such debates go on all the time, even just in the East European area. Moldovans argue about whether they are a distinct entity or just Romanians. Is Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus Mountains Armenian or Azerbaijani? Was Hungary a victim of Nazism in World War II, or was it a collaborator with the Nazis? And more to our point, was the Ukrainian insurgent army, the military arm of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was that army a collaborator of the fascists, as the Russians would have it, or Ukrainian heroes fighting for the independence and creation of a Ukrainian state? There's no question that the collective memories of Jews and Ukrainians are dominated by mutual hostility. Ukrainians have had, until this very moment, a well-deserved reputation among Jews for attacking Jewish neighbors from at least the mid-17th century until the late 1940s. On the other hand, Ukrainians have been convinced for hundreds of years that Jews always side with the oppressors of Ukrainians, primarily Poles and or Russians. The people who have historically oppressed Ukrainians culturally, economically, militarily. Has this mutual suspicion, distrust, and yes, hatred been dispelled or at least somewhat healed by the present war? It's a big question. But let's remember that Jews never live in a vacuum. Even the most self-isolating Jews are directly affected by the economic, political, cultural environment in which they live. So if you'll permit me, I'm going to take a few moments before turning to the specifics of the Jewish situation to explore how that environment has changed within recent months. And the fundamental question is, why did Russia invade its neighbor on February 24th, 2022? After all, these two people are very strongly connected geographically, linguistically. They have shared 70 years of Soviet rule, and they have very strong family ties. Their languages are different, but they're more or less mutually intelligible. Many Russians and Ukrainians have close relatives who are of the other nationality. An 89-year-old woman in Ukraine was quoted in the New York Times 2 days ago as follows. She's in Ukraine. She says, my niece lives in Moscow, but she was born in Slavyansk, which is Ukraine. And now they're sending her husband to the Russian army to fight. What's he supposed to do? Kill his mother-in-law? I'll refrain from any jokes about that. It's quite serious. So why did the war start? I think the fundamental reason is a longstanding desire, not just by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, president of the Russian Federation, but by a considerable segment of the Russian population, to restore Greater Russia. Putin, has called the dissolution, the raspad, the breakdown of the USSR in December 1991, the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Geopolitical tragedy. It was the worst thing that could have happened politically. It's not that Putin regrets the fall of communism. It's that he is pained by the loss of territory and of Russia's superpower status and recognition as a superpower in the world. More keenly than others, he feels deeply humiliated by the loss of status that Russia experienced when, to put it somewhat simplistically, it lost the Cold War. This is not a new theme in Russian history. Stalin made a speech in February 1931, which I'll quote. Russia was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords. And she was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry. She was beaten by the British and the French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. Everyone beat her because of her backwardness, because of her military failings, cultural backwardness, political backwardness, industrial backwardness, and agricultural backwardness. Tavarishji, comrades, will we let Russia be beaten again? No. This was the rationale for the very costly, painful, drastic, rapid industrialization of Russia in the 1930s and the collectivization of agriculture, which cost millions of lives. But the idea was that Russia should not be beaten by any foreign enemy ever again. In fact, in some ways, the Soviet Union was a recreation of a Russian empire. Russians were the dominant people, politically and culturally, one might say even economically, in the Soviet Union. And it had many of the characteristics of an empire. That empire collapsed in 1991. The British, the French, the Belgians, they had empires as late as 1945. But those countries, those states, adapted fairly well, relatively peacefully, with a mixture of resignation and relief to the loss of their empires in Africa and Asia. Many Russians have not yet reconciled themselves to the loss of the Soviet Empire. Putin does not aim to restore communism or even the Tsarist Empire, but he is intent upon achieving parity with the West as a world power. And that means, first of all, territorial restoration, certainly of the two fraternal brother states, that is Belarus, which he already dominates in partnership with a person at least as dictatorial as Putin himself, that is Lukashenko in Belarus, and now Ukraine, the two Slavic states. Territorial expansion, or as he might think, restoration, would show the world that Russia is back. It's a force to be reckoned with in world affairs, despite the rise of China and the dominance, albeit greatly reduced, of the United States. In this region, Ukraine is by far the largest geographic entity with the most people and the most resources. And Ukraine might be easy pickings. Until this year, it was widely considered by the United States as well as a highly corrupt, inefficient country which had leadership instability. It's had 6 presidents since the fall of the Soviet Union, while Russia has had only 2, Yeltsin and Putin. And most absurd of all, it was now headed by a man whose profession was comedy. So maybe Ukraine itself was a joke. Much has been said about the transformation, apparently, of Putin from a clever, crafty, calculating politician to a crazed, cruel, and criminal dictator, whom the gods would destroy, they would first make mad. Is Putin mad? Is he crazy? At the very least, he has grossly miscalculated. What has the war in Ukraine accomplished? First, it has driven the Western countries together to an unparalleled degree in recent decades. Germany, which abjured military force, rearmament for decades after 1945, thank God, is now committing more resources to rebuilding its military. The United States and Britain are seriously contemplating restoring their Cold War military presences on the European continent. Even traditional friends of Russia, such as Bulgaria, and their friendship goes back to the 19th century, are edging away from it. There are enormous amounts, I need not tell you, of Western arms, ammunition, and other materiel pouring into Ukraine. Finland, Sweden are moving from their historic neutrality toward joining NATO. Putin had said that NATO's expansion to Ukraine would be a threat to Russia, and that's not irrational. What can he now say about a much sooner and more likely prospect of Finland, which has an 800-mile-long border with Russia, joining NATO? Second, Russia's attack has driven Ukrainians more closely together than they've ever been. There are lots of cleavages in Ukraine. 17% of the population considers itself ethnically Russian, not Ukrainian. A large number of people who identify as Ukrainians speak Russian, sometimes, like Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, Russian as a first language. There are 3 competing Orthodox churches in Ukraine. There are 3 competing Catholic churches in Ukraine, a host of Protestant churches, historical, cultural differences between the western part of the country, which was under Polish rule, and the eastern part of the country, which in modern times was under Russian rule. And as we say, as it goes with the Christians, so it goes with the Jews. Well, it always goes with the Jews. Jews are never united. So what do we have in Ukraine, and what have we historically had in Ukraine? Differences among Jews. Haskalah versus Hasidut. Orthodox versus Reform or Progressive. Hebraists versus Yiddishists. The Russian economy like the Ukrainian economy and now the Western economies, has taken a very hard hit as a result of the war. And finally, the deficiencies of the Russian military have been exposed for all to see. And gradually, the Russian population is beginning to see it as well. Its losses have been far greater than anticipated. It has been deeply embarrassed by being held at bay, for the most part, by a far smaller force. So, was this decision to go to war completely irrational? If you put yourself into Putin's shoes, I'd hate to be in them right now, I would say the answer is no. It was an egregious miscalculation, but not necessarily an irrational one from his perspective. Adrian, could you put that slide
Absolutely.
of Putin on, please?
Can you see that?
How do you like that table? This is a way of protecting oneself against COVID. No masks, but my gosh, more than 6 feet or meters even of separation. I think it's symbolic of the self-isolation that Putin has imposed upon himself. He has separated himself physically from the people. He does not spend much time in the Kremlin, if at all. He is sequestering himself in a countryside residence, of which he has many. And more importantly, he is surrounded only by toadies and yes men who tell him what they think he wants to hear. Now, that's a behavior not unknown in other countries, including our own, but it's very dangerous. You have no basis for independent judgment if you listen only to people who tell you what they think you want to hear. Putin, not unreasonably, perceived the West as declining culturally, politically, and economically, and therefore a West could not oppose moves that Putin would make, including trying to take over Ukraine. He definitely takes a side in the cultural wars that we see in our country and in many of the other Western countries. He would have people believe that he holds to conservative, Orthodox Christian values against the West's irreligious embrace of same-sex marriage, which is prohibited in Russia, radical feminism, homosexuality, which is still criminal, mass immigration, and other manifestations of what he calls, and he's not the only one, decadence. And this explains the peculiar alliance of right-wing populists in France, Germany, and the United States, their sympathy with Putin and their refusal to criticize what he is doing in Ukraine. Of course, at least 3 American presidents have misjudged Putin. In 2001, you can take the slide down, thanks. George W. Bush said, "I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul." Trump was a friend of Putin and never criticized him. Obama drew a red line in Syria and said that if Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, there would be serious consequences. Assad did so, Obama did nothing. By 2021, Putin perceived that the United States was being led by an ignorant buffoon who could be easily manipulated. Whether that's a correct perception or not, doesn't matter. At the very least, what happened in 2020 divided or showed the divisions in American society to run very deep and very hard. That meant that a successor to Trump would have to focus on domestic crises, such as the Chinese hoax that has killed 1 million Americans, the rifts in American society, the problems of the American economy. Having abruptly pulled out of Afghanistan, the United States would be unlikely to engage in another foreign adventure. Germany was transitioning from the most capable politician in the West, Angela Merkel, to an unknown quantity. France was involved in a national election. Britain was being led by a person involved in many scandals and whose behavior at times seemed to be similar to that of his friend in the White House. Most of all, Ukraine was being led by an untested amateur, a person with no experience in politics or leading a state. This would be a very good time to resume pushing the envelope of expansion, whose purpose is to reassert Russian control over territories, people, and resources that historically and rightfully belong to it. That process had begun back in 1990, when a small sliver of land attached to a very small state of 2.3 million people, Moldova, broke away from Moldova and proclaimed itself the Pridnestrovye Republic, the Dniester Republic. Russians, Ukrainians, Slavs, who still use the Russian rubles and who accommodate a force of about 1,500 Russian soldiers now since 1990. Let's go a little further. 2008, the Russians attack the Republic of Georgia, and they succeed in extracting two regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, from the Georgian Republic. Well, there are protests in the West. They last about 2 days, but no one really cares about Georgia. No one can find it on a map. They don't know whether its capital is Atlanta or Macon. It's all very confusing. And who ever heard of Ossetians or Abkhazians? More seriously, perhaps, in 2014, as I mentioned before, Crimea is annexed by Russia, and the world does nothing but issue some protests. That happens in Chechnya in 1999, when the capital of Chechnya, part of the Russian Republic, is bombed into extinction. The city named Grozny, which happens to mean horrible or terrible in Russian, is practically wiped off the map by the Russians. Haleb or Aleppo in Syria, bombed in 2016 by a Russian Air Force. And then you have these two statelets, these mini states, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, which split away from Ukraine and remain detached from Ukraine, although there is an ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, a low-intensity war. about these two? Well, in Yiddish, we say, der Appetit wächst mit dem Essen. One's appetite increases as one eats more and more. Putin could reasonably assume that there would be no retaliation for a further incursion into Ukraine. Yes, it would be a quantum leap in expansionism, but it could be done. After all, when the Soviet Union collapsed, 28 million ethnic Russians found themselves outside of the Russian Federation, outside of the Russian state. They were co-ethnics, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, one of Putin's fans, despite the fact that Hungary is in the EU and in NATO. Viktor Orban grants ethnic Magyars, Hungarians, the right to vote in Hungarian national elections, even if they live in Slovakia or Romania or anywhere else in the Magyar diaspora. They're our people. Maybe the analogy is imperfect, but many Israelis believe that they are connected to the Jewish people, although that feeling is diminishing, wherever those Jewish people may be, and that the Israeli state, defining itself as a Jewish state, has a responsibility of protecting and defending the interests of Jews the world over. Why shouldn't the same apply to Russia? I think, and I'm not alone in this, that the Russians were justifiably worried in 2004 when Western politicians made noises about Ukraine joining NATO. It was unnecessary, impractical, and provocative. How would the American population feel if hostile military forces, hostile to the United States, emplaced themselves in Canada or Mexico? From his point of view, that was the meaning of expanding NATO to include Ukraine. A better Western choice would have been Finlandization, namely granting these territories complete freedom in domestic policy, but no formal alliance with the West. Well, as it turns out, today, literally, Finlandization doesn't even apply to Finland itself. Finland is no longer Finlandized. It is now moving to associate itself with NATO rather than remain absolutely neutral in foreign affairs. And Sweden, which has occupied the same position, may soon follow. Since 2018, the United States, Turkey, Great Britain have sold or supplied Ukraine with armaments, drones, and Russia sees this as an accumulation of a potential military force which could attack Russia. Just as the Soviet Union had emplaced missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the American coast in 1962, and the United States took it very seriously because we saw it as being on the brink of a nuclear war, so too did Putin perceive the possible expansion of NATO to Ukraine as an existential threat. So there were reasons for Putin to attempt to gain control of Ukraine. But as a result of self-isolation spurred by COVID, misinformation, which was an old Russian tradition, by the way. Some of you may remember Gogol's play, The Inspector General, or the idea of a Potemkin village, fooling the ruler into thinking that things are much better than they really are. falsifying economic data during Stalinism because you had to meet the economic plan, else you would be fired or much worse, and therefore reporting false data to the economic planners, screwing up the centralized economy because decisions were made on untruthful data. That's an old tradition. Lie to the boss. Cook the books. Big mistake. In the event, the Russians did not have a cheap and quick victory. And how does Putin react? Like a petulant child who, when not getting his or her way, escalates conflict, strikes out harder at another child or an adult, or cries even louder. Rage and frustration have combined to turn the Russian military into a criminal, Nazi-like force, which wantonly rapes women, kills children, civilians, with no ideological, racial, or other reason to justify that. At least the Nazis had a false reason, but a reason, a rationale. Ironically, and this is one of many ironies in this tale, Russian soldiers are behaving the way their Soviet great-grandfathers did in Germany in 1945, stealing, raping, killing civilians. But their ancestors were taking revenge for the atrocities that the Germans had perpetrated in their country, which lost 27 million people in World War II. 27 million, 9 million of whom were combatants, but 18 million of whom, including 2.5 million Jews, were civilians. What have the Ukrainians done to deserve being treated the same way that the Germans were treated in 1945? An even greater irony is the absurd rationale for invading Ukraine to denazify it, when it is the Russian military which is acting like Nazis, bombing hospitals, residential quarters, stealing money, stealing goods, driving people from their homes. Yes, about 500,000 Ukrainians collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. 500,000. It's very hard to be certain about that. But 4.5 million Ukrainians served in the Red Army in World War II. Far more Ukrainians fought the Nazis than fought with them. I had an interesting experience in 1993. I taught for several weeks at a university in Lviv. Russians called it Lvov, the Poles called it Lvov, the Germans and the Jews called it Lemberg, same place. I was hosted by a political scientist at the university, and we had a day off on May 9th because it was Victory Day. And he suggested that we go to the countryside and have a picnic. And I said, no, I'd really like to see the parade in Lviv. And he said, well, it might get a little tense. I said, oh, then I'd really like to see it. So we went. At the end of the biggest square in the city, at one end stood a group of old men wearing yellow and blue uniforms, most of which didn't fit. They were the uniforms they had worn during the war. They were members of the UPA, of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. At the other end stood another group of old men wearing World War II Red Army uniforms. They had fought against the guys at the opposite end. They were all Ukrainians. Fortunately, they didn't fight that day. But the rift, the division, the disputes, the debates were made vividly clear to me, who had no axe to grind in this, no skin in this game. In fact, in recent elections in Ukraine, neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic parties, which exist, have never gotten enough votes to send more than one deputy to the Rada, to the National Parliament. Yes, the Azov Regiment, which is a neo-Nazi organization fighting for Ukraine in the most heavily embattled places today, but it has fewer than 1,000 fighters. And irony of ironies, and don't ask me to explain it because I can't understand it, the Azov Regiment, this anti-Semitic armed group, was funded by Igor Kolomeisky, a Jewish oligarch who has very generously funded Chabad in his city of Dnipropetrovsk. Finally, there are signs, especially in his speech on May 9th, just a few days ago on Victory Day, that Putin is beginning to realize his error and its monumental costs. Now his calculation has to be, how do I climb down from this without losing face? Humiliation is the worst thing that can happen to a defeated nation. The Allies humiliated Germany after World War I. They paid the price 20 years later. The Arabs were humiliated in 1948, and that conflict has gone on ever since. The West should resist the strong temptation to humiliate a defeated Russia, should Russia be defeated. There's an old Jewish joke. It's a class in zoology at the university. And the professor asks the students to write a paper about the elephant. The German student writes a paper which is a Prolegomena zu der Vorgeschichte zu der Biologie von der Elefant. The British student writes a paper on hunting the elephant in Africa. The French student writes, love among the elephants. And the Jewish student writes, the elephant and the Jewish problem. So I turn now not to the elephant, but the Jewish problem. Maybe it's the elephant in the room, I don't know. As I mentioned before, Jews and Ukrainians have had a fraught, tense, and frankly, murderous relationship for at least 374 years. Why do I pick that number? Because in the year 1648, what Jews call Gzerot Tach V'Tat, the decrees of 1648, a person who was to become a great Ukrainian national hero led an uprising of peasants who didn't know that they were Ukrainians at the time because Ukrainian national consciousness did not exist until the 1830s and 40s. But nevertheless, retroactively, we can understand that they would have been Ukrainians. These peasants rose against the oppression of their Polish landlords, who were generally absent from the farms, from their estates, living in palaces, often Krakow or other major cities of Poland, but collecting taxes from those peasants which of course the peasants resented. Who collected the taxes from those Ukrainian peasants? The Jewish stewards of the Polish estates. Are you getting confused? You should be. This has always been an ethnically mixed, confusing region. But try to, as they used to say at Yankee Stadium, can't tell the players without a scorecard. Try to keep it straight. The Poles own the estate. The Ukrainians work it. The Jews are not allowed to own land, but they know how to read and write, and they can do figures. That is not true of the Ukrainian peasants. So the Jews collect 6 eggs for Mikhailo or Mikola, the Ukrainian peasant, 2 geese, 3 chickens, give those to the Polish landlord, and the Polish landlord lets the Jew keep 1 egg, 1 chicken, etc. When this Ukrainian hero, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and Adrian, you can show the slide, rallies these Ukrainian peasants against the Poles are nowhere to be found. Who is there? The Jewish stewards. A rabbi named Natan Hanover wrote a classic book with wrong figures called Yevain Metzula, the depths of despair, about the pogroms of 1648. We now think not 100,000 Jews were killed, but 18,000. Remember, we're talking about the 17th century. 18,000 is a huge number. This is Khmelnytsky, a great equestrian statue in the center of Kiev today. And the Soviets managed to assimilate him into their narrative of Ukrainian history. Was Khmelnytsky a Ukrainian nationalist? No. Khmelnytsky, you see, was a leader of the oppressed working classes, the peasantry, fighting against the aristocracy. Well, that's a perfectly good Marxist thing to do. And when I visited Kiev for the first time in 1966, I had to have an in-tourist guide take me around. And this young, very nice fellow did so. And we came to the statue and he said, well, this is a statue of Bohdan Khmelnytsky. He led the Ukrainians in their fight against the Poles in 1648. I said, oh, yeah, 1648. And he says, gee, you're an American. How the heck do you know about 1648? Well, I said, I studied Jewish history. And on the left, we have the Dynamo Stadium. Our most famous football club plays in this stadium. He knew that I knew, and we both knew, and we changed the subject. You can take the slide down. In 1881, what the Hebrew press called Hasufot Banegev, the storms in the south. It was a euphemism for pogroms in Ukraine. In 1881, pogroms broke out. Widespread attacks on Jews, mainly by Ukrainians and Poles, and that drove a large part of your ancestors to the United States. Between 1881 and the outbreak of World War I, approximately 1.9 million Jews emigrated from the Russian Empire, many of them from what we now call Ukraine, to North America, to the United States. In 1905, another wave of pogroms. In 1918, 1921, a massive loss of Jewish life, which today is largely unknown because of events that happened exactly 20 years following that, which we call the Holocaust. 100,000 Jews at a minimum were killed largely by Ukrainians in the so-called Russian Civil War of 1918-1921. Can you bring up some slides of that?
Sure, hang on.
Children killed in Yekaterinoslav now has a different name. In a Ukrainian pogrom, 1918, 1919. Now, this was not Nazi industrialized killing. This was face-to-face, neighbor-to-neighbor, personal attacks, one upon another. Next slide. A family. Look at the legs of the children. You've seen such images before. You've associated it with the Shoah. This is the Shoah 20 years before the Shoah. Next slide. Jews tried to defend themselves. Self-defense, samobrona in Russian. This is an unusual group because not only did they have rifles, usually Jews had only pickaxes, knives, butcher's instruments, but they even had, as you can see in the front row, a machine gun. Next slide. Okay, you can take that down. We'll get to that. Between the two world wars, Ukrainian nationalism, which was anti-Soviet and anti-Polish, because those were the two states that ruled over Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalism became increasingly fascistic and anti-Semitic. They were non-discriminatory haters. They hated the Russians, the Poles, and the Jews, and perceived all of them as enemies. During World War II, 20 years later, Ukrainian nationalists joined the Ukrainian insurgent army, which cooperated with the Nazis for a while and went out on its own to kill Jews. Ukrainians joined the so-called SS Halichina, the Galician SS division, for which 80,000 Ukrainians applied. Only 16,000 only were accepted. Two Nazi regular military formations. And the result was that about 1.5 million Jews in Ukraine were killed by the Germans primarily, such as the rabbi referred to it before as Babin Yar, where 33,771 Jews were murdered between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur on September 29, 30, 1941, but also by Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, and Hungarians. One more irony. You all saw how the Poles are welcoming, literally with open arms, over 3 million, perhaps by now 4 million Ukrainian refugees. In 1943, the Ukrainian insurgent army murdered approximately 40 to 50,000 Poles in occupied Ukraine. This is why Tim Snyder, in his book on the region, titled the book Bloodlands. It was not quite a war of all against war, to use the Hobbesian term, but it is earth soaked in many people's blood over many centuries. For several years now, Ukrainian patriotism has promoted the reputations and images of anti-Semitic Ukrainian national heroes, including those who openly murdered Jews during the war. There are, for example, several dozen monuments and scores of street names dedicated to Stepan Bandera, a leader of the Ukrainian insurgent army, who, by the way, was assassinated by a Soviet NKVD agent in 1959 in Munich. There's a major boulevard in Kiev leading to Babi Yar, which is called in the name of Stepan Bandera. Even without the Nazis, thousands of Ukrainians were involved in torturing and murdering Jews. In Lviv, now very much in the news, you got a CNN reporter in Lviv all the time. A Ukrainian state was proclaimed on July 1st, 1941, after the corpses of Ukrainian nationalists who had been shot by the Soviet secret police were discovered in 3 prisons in town. The assumption that many Ukrainians made was that the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, was staffed primarily by Jews. Ergo, it was the Jews who had killed the Ukrainians. Ergo, it follows that the Jews should be punished for the crime. Thousands of Jews were rounded up, taken to the 3 prisons, and made to wash the bodies, bury them, and then somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Jews were killed in 2 separate pogroms in July of 1941. I quote a non-Jewish eyewitness: blood pouring down their faces. These were the lucky ones who survived the pogroms. Holes in their heads, hands broken, and their eyes hanging out of their sockets. Soldiers were holding clubs and were lashing out and hitting anyone who crossed their path. There were rows of Jews lying one on top of the other like pigs, whimpering horribly. Now, Ukraine has a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, after having had a Jewish prime minister, Volodymyr Groysman, 2016 to 2019. That's as ridiculous as an African-American lesbian being the governor of Mississippi in 1950. I don't know how to put it any more starkly. If I told my Zeta, or even my father, that Ukraine had a Jewish president, okay, they were from Belarus, we're Litvakis, we're not Ukrainian Jews, but we know about Ukrainians. Which Jew doesn't? I'd have no credibility. Both Ukraine and Russia have good relations with the state of Israel, which is a problem for the state of Israel, of course. Putin, who has many Jewish friends since childhood, says repeatedly that Zelensky heads a Nazi state and the Russian mission is denazification. So the question naturally arises, how can a Nazi state be headed by a Jew? No, it's not a shaila, it's not a difficult question, answers his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Even Hitler probably had Jewish ancestry. Jewish-Ukrainian relations actually began to get better under very peculiar circumstances in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Ukrainian cultural and political activists met Jewish cultural and political activists where? In the Gulag. They were both punished by the Soviet state for their adherence to their people and those people's cultures, both of which had been suppressed, although the Jewish culture was far more suppressed of course, than the Ukrainian. There is not a single post-Soviet government in the 15 or 16 successor states that pursues an anti-Semitic policy. Contrast that with the Soviet Union after World War II. Jewish life in Ukraine revived to a considerable extent after the fall of the Soviet Union. Jewish schools, Jewish religion, Chabad, Karlin Stolin of the Hasidic groups, progressive or Reform Judaism, travel to and from Israel, cultural activities, Jewish community centers. The vast majority of Ukrainian Jews, like Russian Jews, are not at all religious. They are deeply Jewish in their identities. They are searching for a secular cultural means of expressing that identity. And the JCCs are a place where they can find lectures, musical groups, dance groups, eat Jewish foods, learn about Jewish traditions, and celebrate Jewish holidays in the way that they wish. The Joint Distribution Committee in 2020 sent $64 million to Ukraine and $67 million to Russia to support these activities. In the current crisis, there are at least 300 JDC volunteers in Ukraine walking by foot because public transportation is very iffy to help bedridden, old, disabled Jews, some of whom are survivors of the Shoah, in their places of residence. The Joint estimates that about 30,000 Jews, and what we mean by Jews are what Russians call the Chok HaShvut Yevrei, which is a very strange term. It takes the Hebrew words Chok HaShvut, law of return, and Russifies it. Jews according to the law of return, not halacha, but a person who has a Jewish spouse, a Jewish grandparent, doesn't matter, maternal or paternal. These are people who are eligible to immediately immigrate to the state of Israel. There are about 30,000 of those Jews left in Ukraine. And the Jewish Agency, the State of Israel, and other organizations are arranging and promoting Aliyah. Some of you of a certain age may remember a song after World War II in Yiddish. Wohin soll ich gehen? Wer kann entfernen mir? Wohin soll ich gehen? Als verschlossen jeder Tür. Oh, where can I go? Because every door is closed. Today, the door of Israel is open. Honestly, the majority of Jewish refugees from Ukraine would probably prefer, this is irony number 36, I think, that I've mentioned, would prefer to go to Germany than to Israel. And we can explore that. So, Israel is conflicted. It's being forced to choose between two nominally friendly states who are now at war with each other. Why does Israel refuse to condemn Russia, like India, by the way, but for different reasons, when the whole concatenation of states who are democratic do so? In order to carry out military operations, particularly Air Force operations in Syria, against Hezbollah and other Iranian-sponsored groups, which threaten to terrorize Israel. Israel needs the cooperation of the Russian Air Force and Russian people who control the airspace over Syria. It cannot afford to offend Russia. But Ukraine, after all, suffering as Jews have suffered for centuries, Ukraine, which seems to have turned the corner and not be anti-Semitic. So there's a kind of good cop, bad cop division of labor between the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who will not offend Russia. In fact, he fancied himself a mediator and went to see Putin in Moscow, achieving nothing. And Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister, who condemns Russia and openly supports Ukraine. So who speaks for Israel? They want to keep it ambiguous. I'll conclude with a couple of scenarios that I think are possible, but I warn you. The Talmud says, Mishecharav bet hamikdash nitna hanvuah liktanim v'shotim. From the destruction of the temple, which of course occurred in the year 70 of the Common Era, the gift of prophecy was given to fools and small children. A very difficult idea, but I know that I'm no longer a child. So if I dare prophesy, that leaves only one category in which I can fit. The most pessimistic scenario is that the Russian escalation of military conquest, the murder of civilians, forces a military response from the West, not just supplying arms and ammunition, but getting directly involved. It may be an accidental involvement. It may be a purposive one. If so, then President Biden's worst nightmare will come to fruition. There will be a direct conflict between Russia and NATO, possibly with nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons deployed. And I need not elaborate on the consequences. On the other hand, the most optimistic scenario from a Ukrainian and possibly a Western point of view is that some Russian elites, not the oligarchs who have no control over Putin, they depend on him rather than he depending on them, but the so-called siloviki, the power holders, the people of 22 Russian governmental agencies which have the means of armed conflict at their disposal, the police, the secret police, the army, the militias, etc., that these elites begin to perceive that Russia is suffering a great defeat. This could be accompanied by a defection of confused and disillusioned Russian troops, perhaps even by the revival of the mass demonstrations against the war that did happen at the beginning of the war on various streets of various cities, that all these combine to force the replacement of Putin, or to be frank, the elimination of Putin by a leadership willing to cut their losses and negotiate an end to hostilities. In between these optimistic and pessimistic scenarios is a prolonged conflict, a frozen conflict, such as the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan or between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that's unlikely because the ferocity of the Russian actions has been such that you cannot envision a moderate war, if there's such a thing. Perhaps Putin would declare that the mission has been accomplished, that the ethnic Russians are safe, and that the fascist elements, while still dangerous in Ukraine, have been defeated. Having saved at least some face, Russia may shift to concentrating on replacing Zelensky and his cohort. As far as Jews are concerned, There will be accelerated emigration in all of these scenarios. Germany is likely to be the main host country. The United States and Israel will also be hosts, as they have been for the 1.6 million Jews who have left the Soviet Union and its successor states since 1971. That will probably bring to an end a long, often bloody, but also glorious chapter in Jewish history. One question is, how much have the Ukrainians changed? Is there a tectonic shift where particularly younger generations of Ukrainians, having been led heroically and bravely by a Jewish president during this time of enormous crisis, has this generation acquired the capability of disabusing itself of centuries of mythology and hatred? And this will mark a turning point in Jewish-Ukrainian relations? Or are we witnessing a transient infatuation which will pass when the crisis does? The prophet says, Lo navi anochi v'lo ben navi, ki im boles shikmim. I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but a mere trimmer of sycamores. I'm not a trimmer of sycamores, but I'm certainly not a prophet. Thanks for your attention.
Professor Gitelman, thank you so much. I see everybody applauding wildly for you, as they should. We're so grateful for your insights, not only on the current state of this terrible war, but on the long and complicated history of Jews in Ukraine. I know we've kept you longer than we said we would, but I see.
No, I kept you long.
No, it's our pleasure. Thank you. We're so grateful for your insights and your amazing breadth of knowledge here. We do have a quick question in the chat, and I'll declare this the last call for any questions. Somebody asked, does Russia have designs on Moldova?
I think the answer is pretty clear. If they're defeated in Ukraine, they cannot proceed to Moldova. If they perceive that they have won in Ukraine, Moldova will be a pushover, comparatively speaking. Ukraine is a much bigger prize with its nearly 40 million people than is Moldova with less than 3 million. Not to speak of the enormous natural resources that Ukraine has. Coal, breadbasket, not just of the old Soviet Union, but as we see now, even to some extent of the world. Metals, industry, a little bit of petroleum. So I think that the Ukrainian conflict is crucial in determining whether Russia will go further or not.
You, Professor Gitelman. Any other last questions? Okay, I think we're just going to thank you deeply for this incredibly informative and enlightening program. And we are so grateful to have had you here to share this knowledge with us and your insights with us. And we hope that this will come, obviously, to the speediest possible and most peaceful possible resolution. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And we hope to see you all very soon. Professor Gitelman, thank you again from everybody here at Temple Sinai.
My great pleasure, and I wish you all the best in the coming days and weeks.
Thank you so much. The
I like
very
those.
same to
Thank you.
Good night,
everybody. Thank you,
everyone.
Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.